huge swings in gains of muscular strength or size. That study basically tried to do exactly what you're describing, which was to test everybody genetically and figure out whether we could relate particular genetic typing to particular gains responsiveness, if you like. And unfortunately, it wasn't able to do that very convincingly. And we don't know really for certain what genetic traits are predictors of responsiveness. I mean, a very interesting study came out just a couple of months ago by Cam Mitchell. He basically looked at responsiveness and found that as you get towards the elderly population, the number of people who don't respond diminishes to almost zero. So I think when your training status is very, very, very low, everybody responds. It's just when you take a normal group of people, you do find there are some that don't respond. So basically what we found, you've got old people who are detrained and a bit atrophied, you will always see some kind of response.
I'll be able to add quickly.
Please.
So some work that we've so some work that we've just done is in part trying to look at that question, albeit in a more clinical population, so pre-diabetic through to type 2 diabetic. And these populations that we call non-responders, people who are going the opposite way, having an atrophy, if you will. What we found that with those populations, we actually have to reduce the load. And if we reduce the load and we increase the recovery time between their actual sessions, we see some modest gains. So the answer, roughly, to your question is the research is starting to show that instead of trying to increase the load, increase the recovery and drop the load.
That's very interesting because one of the things I nearly talked about when I mentioned the Marshall study, which tried the 1, 4 and 8 sets of squats, they found something that rarely happens in studies of long-term strength training, which is that rate of force development went down. Now that just doesn't happen. In fact, it actually provoked a letter to the editor from Anthony Plezovic because he wanted to know why. And that was really interesting because rate of force development is something that actually tends to go down if you aren't recovered properly. And I wonder whether that is actually quite pertinent to those results. So perhaps 8 sets, yes, you do get stronger, but those people were not recovering properly.
In terms of muscular failure, are we talking just technical failure with the exercise? Or is it all out, balls to the walls, everything into it and grinding out every last ounce?
Again, there's a practical answer here, there's a research answer, and obviously you're going to determine for your client what's best at that time. And that will be absolutely down to your professional judgment. I think the study by Jürgen Giesing last year did this study where they looked at 2 groups, one which was self-determined failure, so what the client thought they were failing at, and actual failure where they just made them train until they couldn't train anymore. And they found that making the client go all the way to failure did have a slightly better response than allowing the client to determine, yes, that's as much as I can reach my last rep, rather than being encouraged to do one more. Now, they were using entirely machine-based training, and obviously under supervision, which obviously you're talking about. I would never, personally, if I were coaching somebody, I would never, there were certain exercises that I would never let them go to failure on anyway, just simply because I wouldn't be comfortable allowing them to go that far.
And is it one set to failure or is it multiple sets to failure on the same exercise?
Again, so when we talk about progression, you might start out with none.
Yeah.
And then over a period of time when your client's comfortable, you might say, well, let's start adding the first set, the last set to failure. Last set's usually good, now better. And then over a period of time, you might say, right, I'm going to work through a cycle and start pushing up the number of sets you go to failure. And at the end of it, we've maybe gone from 1 set but not to failure to 4 sets all to failure. And if that person hasn't got bigger in that process, then nothing's going to make it work. You know, so I think you can modulate volume and proximity to failure within the bounds of your own professional judgment of what you think is safe. I mean, at the end of the day, going back to the bottom of the pyramid, if the client isn't showing up because they got hurt, then they're not getting any better. So,
I assume everything's talking about natural athletes.
yes. You wouldn't want me talking here if we were talking about non-natural. Somebody else. Well, I won't name.
Yeah, I've worked on this before. Just out of interest, you know, when you was talking about different variables of training,
Yes.
and it was said the volume was 13 studies. Is that just based on your company that's kind of assessed, or is that nationwide, globally?
That's pretty much it.
So that's it. So all the guidelines are based on 13 studies.
So what I can hear is pull together everything that we've found ever.
Because when you're going back to the actual testing of how many tests you need to bring about guidelines, for example, that guy threw 2 balls, he ended up throwing 100. Surely it needs to be a lot more tests than 12 to get any of these guidelines.
Now you're starting to think like we do.
I just thought at 13, I've done sports science and stuff like that, and I just thought that might be in your company, but that's globally, that's all it's been done. Yeah.
So what we're looking at here, and just to be very clear, 13 studies which have compared groups training with different volumes.
Yeah.
Obviously you can find a study that's used a volume and another study that's used a different volume. You can't compare those two studies. Just because one study's done one set and another study's used 3 sets. There could be different samples, there could be different environments. One could have been supervised, one could have been non-supervised. So you can't compare. The only studies we can use are where you have 2 groups in the same study. One that's used 1 set, one that's used 3 sets or 4 sets, or however many sets. And the biggest issue we've got is that measuring muscular size is really, really hard. It's really tough. You can't just, like with strength, you just throw the guy at the leg press and say, you know, see how much weight you can move, tick, done. It's really tough to get the same quality measurement with muscular size. So it's very expensive.
How are they actually measuring muscle size?
In many different ways. Girth runs into the problem of what we call being fuscular. So you can, fat gets in the way.
Yeah.
You're measuring fat as well as muscle.
Yeah.
The gold standard methods that we have are MRI and CT scans, and then a slightly less highly regarded method, which is very popular now, is ultrasound, because you can do it, it's a small piece of kit, you can do it quite easily in a small lab, whereas MRI and CT are a lot bigger, involved procedures. There are other ways, I'm not going to go into every single way, but those are the ones that most are done. If you want lean mass, you can use DEXA, which is quite easy to get hold of, but what you're not doing then is measuring the individual mass of a muscle, you're measuring the whole body lean mass, and that can change in other ways. So yes, I think you're right, there are very few studies, but the point is that what we're looking at is any study is always going to be better than being fooled by randomness or survival bias.
Chris, I'm going to ask a question. You talked about, you're obviously a subject matter expert and heading the research and the journal articles, and the guys out there on the gym floor working with the clients. What advice would you give to them in terms of helping, how can they develop their own understanding of research? Because it's quite a complicated area to understand, get your head in a journal article and actually understand what the hell it's saying. So, other than spending $10 a month, obviously, on S&C research, which is what you do, what kind of tips can you give the guys to help develop their understanding?
But to be honest, I wasn't going to plug.
I'll plug it. I think it's fantastic, and if anybody's not aware of it, then get on the website. And it's not expensive, but these guys do all the hard work for you.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is go and look at the encyclopedia that we've built. It's free. You just go online, look at it, the website, and you can just click through to any study you like and look at it, and we set out very simple descriptions of what was done and what's happened and what it means. And we group them. So, like you were saying, we've grouped every single study that's been done in a given area. So, I think one of the problems that you will face if you try and learn from online experts who quote literature at you, they say, this is what happens, and they quote 2 or 3 studies. Well, as we've seen, you can't do that. You can't just quote 2 or 3 studies. You have to say, there have been 13 studies done, and 4 studies showed that. If somebody says to you, I think this and you should too because 1 study said that, you know that they're talking rubbish, because there has never been 1 study done on something. Well, very few areas where there's been 1 study done on something, unless it's an emerging area. You know, most of the time, if somebody's talking about, you know, muscle action or range of motion or loads or whatever they're talking about, there's always been a number of studies. Unless you say, this is the number of studies that have been done, these are the studies that have found a positive result, then you're just doing WYSIWYG again. You're just saying what you see is all there is. You know, you're just saying, we're going to look at the positive results and ignore all the negative ones that we don't want to think about. And so I would encourage you to go on the website and just have a kick around. It's basically Wikipedia for you guys. That's all it is. You know, and all the bits that I think you'll be most interested in are completely free. So just go and kick it around.
Any other questions?
What percentage of relative load's been proven to be most effective?
None.
None, just volume.
I don't think any relative load is definitely better than any other relative load. When we talk about heavy and light loads, we generally literally drawing the line at 50%. So you're really talking light loads, you're talking 30, 40, 50 rep sets. So realistically, anything under 15 reps as a rep max is about 65% of 1 repetition maximum. Some people say 60, 60 to 65. So if you're doing anything 15 rep max and fewer reps, then you're probably in the sweet spot.
So as long as you're matching your volume and it's below 15.
Doesn't mean you
If
can't
it's
go
just
over.
hypertrophy, if it's
Yeah.
not for strength.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean you can't go over 15 from time to time if you choose. You may say, actually, I can get more volume by taking my client to 20. They quite enjoy training up to that level, and they can use a lighter load, and from time to time, or in some sets or in some exercises, I can use that effectively. The thing is, it's not ineffective. It's just probably slightly less effective. And I think this is one of the messages that I tried to get over when I spoke at Royal Society of Medicine recently, is that just turning up and doing it is better than not. But the difference between getting it perfect and getting it not quite perfect is very, very small.
So was it the recent study that matched volume but had high load and moderate load or something? Was it, who did it? Was it Brad Schoenfeld who did the recent one?
So I had to submit this presentation before Brad's paper came out, so it's not been included in the numbers. The results of that study, what they did was they compared a powerlifting program with a bodybuilding program. So they basically, essentially, they matched, I can't remember whether they matched volume, load or volume, but they matched one of the two. And basically kind of ended up doing 3 sets of 10 or 10 sets of 3. Broadly speaking. I don't think it was quite that clear cut, but it was broadly that effect. And they found there was no difference between the two in terms of size gains, but there was in terms of strength gains.
Yeah.
I believe.
Well, the 10 threes takes forever.
But the 10 sets of 3 takes forever, and nobody wants to do it. And I think the interesting part was that the bodybuilders, having done their bodybuilding group, having done their 3 sets of 10, would quite happily have done another 2 or 3 sets. You find me somebody who does 10 sets of 3 and wants to do another couple of sets, and I'll be very surprised to meet them. So yes, absolutely. Practically speaking, and this comes back to what I'm saying about optimal repetition ratios. They're not magical, they're just practical. They're absolutely in your guys' expertise areas. You figure out what works best. I'll just say, you know, broadly speaking, this works better than that. And then I'm really just drawing very simple lines in the sand, saying, you know, if you work under 15 repetition maximum most of the time, it's probably going to be slightly better.
Because when you were referring to heavy and light, I was thinking you were talking 3 reps versus 8 or 3 versus 10.
Sorry, I should have been more clear with that. Basically, the studies that have been done are generally comparing below 50%.
Right.
So that's like 30 or 40 reps. So it is really light. But nevertheless, you can still get improvements.
Sorry. You see, most of those, I've got kind of two questions. Do most of those researchers apply to both populations, so male and female, or was it predominantly?
I think there is a very strong bias towards males in the research.
Yeah.
Some studies have a mixed population, and very, very few are all female. But I would say it's probably 70-odd%, something like that, males, broadly.
So would you apply the same principles to females, or?
I think that would be the subject of an entirely separate talk. Did you have a second question? Or
And you said you don't. There's some exercises you don't let pushing people to failure on. So if you're trying to establish, like I don't know, like you said, if you're trying to do 65% of a 5RM or 1RM, would you do the 5RM as opposed to doing the 1RM? Because maybe you might not want to push them to 1RM on a squat, or 5RM who's a bit more comfortable, and then take percentage from that to use in the program.
I think that's a practical question. I mean, I don't have a view for your client base. I mean, I have worked with people, and we've done 1RM max testing. I've worked with people who've done 5RM max testing because it was appropriate for that group. I think it's your call.
Yeah. Thanks.
I was going to ask the rationale behind doing split routines. A lot of the time, a lot of our members ask, "Oh, should I be doing like a big varied routine, or maybe do legs one day and so on and so on?" Is that emphasising volume on those 3 days, and would that lead to better gains from that, or can you still, if you do the right programming, and they still come in on the 3 days a week doing the same full body program, would that still have the same sort of gains as opposed to just doing a split over 3 days?
So just to be clear what we're saying, are we saying that the volume of exercise across the whole week is the same in both groups? They're just allocating it into different sessions?
Yes.
I don't think we really know the answer to that question yet. And I think it's probably because there are a lot of individual differences. So we were talking about recovery. Some people recover from a workout faster than others. So, you may feel that, somebody training legs 3 days a week, they don't recover quickly enough. They maybe have to only train legs less frequently, but do more volume when they do.
Over the course of the month, say if they did one group on one day, like Wednesday, Monday and Friday, could that in theory lead to better gains as opposed to doing like a kind of an all-in-one over those 3 days? Or is it still?
I think if you're volume matching over the course of the week, I don't think you're going to see massive differences.
Does it matter with stimulating muscle protein synthesis over the frequency versus the once a week?
All I can say is that the research on frequency is limited.
Right.
It's the same question, I just don't know. From what we can tell, frequency isn't as important as volume. I think when you start to get down to the levels of elite bodybuilders who are training one muscle group once a week, I think that's probably got to the point where it's probably detrimental for general populations. I would probably be looking to train a muscle group twice a week at least. And that's really very sketchy though. I don't have the evidence to give you.
Hi guys, I think we are just about done there. So if you give Chris a big round of applause. Chris, it's been fantastic this morning. I hope you guys have learned a lot and some useful tips to take away with you. So if you're staying in here, obviously chill out for a few minutes. Otherwise, if you want to head out the doors that way, if you need the toilets, then they're just around to the right hand side. And then obviously you need to be heading off to your next route as quick as you can. Next session will start at 10 to 12.
I let you down. I'm sorry, I let you down, I know.
I'm single-handedly responsible for thinking about it. What's your background? Create video for if they're interested in it. Where do you spur signs?
Yeah.
Paul Russell? No. Not really.
Guys, what's bars?
Got everything you need, Ben?
Thanks, yeah.
So you leave that.
Yeah, I've been on that one before. What time's next? What's it? What? 10 to?
Should we go central? Quite central.
Guys, we've got seats in the middle, so not everybody's not too spread out. Guys, you want to shuffle into the middle? Spread yourselves out, team. Will you stay there all day? Yeah, I'm not moving. Okay guys, we're just about to start now, so I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Ben Kelly. He's going to do a session around HIIT and health. Obviously, in around 10 minutes time, we will just need to break for the 1 minute silence. I'll make sure I've got the clock running for that. And yeah, here's Ben for you.
Hello everyone, can everyone hear me, first of all? Yeah. Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, so thanks for inviting me, Chris. The first PT conference, I'm sure it's just the first of many more to come. Good to see so many of you taking time out to come and listen to us talk. And also thank you to Chris, all of you who were in Chris's talk this morning, framing research in general. I think has set the scene really well for me, because I'm going to take that and give you an example of some actual research, a trial that is going to be specific, or at least give you some insight into how you might build that into the things that you do day to day. So for those of you who I haven't met before, I'm actually the professional head of digital services, clinical lead of digital services. So you might be thinking, well, why the hell are you talking to us about HIT and health? This cowboy who works with computers and IT. I don't. My background is actually in clinical research, and it's only recently that I've moved to Nuffield from that role. So my research in particular looked at clinical models, looked at people with chronic cardiovascular diseases, but my personal interest was in how we could help those people without having to give them drugs, non-pharmacological interventions, which happen to be, in some cases, exercise and diet. So hopefully what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of a flavour of some of the work that I've done in that area. But I'm actually under a little bit of pressure today for a few reasons. Firstly, this is the first time this data has been presented anywhere in the world ever. So there's a lot of potential for cock-up, so bear with me. Chris only got this presentation last night, so bear with me. Secondly, Chris was very direct when he said, Ben, this is about education. We can't have a quick talk and you can disappear and get drunk early. So apologies for the length that I'll go on about. I'm sorry, because I know you're not. And also, I think I've got a bit of pressure because I thought I was going to be the only person from digital services here today, so if I did make a bit of a tit out of myself, it would just be me. But we've got Joe Richards with us today. Goes away, Joe. So if I did make a tit out of myself, don't let me reflect to the entire group. Okay, so a bit of an outline of what I'm going to go through today, time permitting. I'm going to give you an introduction to the Metabrick Consortium. Now that was my particular research group. I'll tell you a little bit about how research groups are formed and work. An introduction to the particular trial that I'm going to present to you today, the HIT trial. And then I'm going to go into a really basic justification of why we've come sort of full circle into not just looking at HIT from a performance perspective, but looking how we can apply it to our clinical populations or people who we wouldn't typically associate with doing HIT type of training. I'll give you a little idea of the sorts of methodologies that go into creating a study of this type. And then the important bits really that you might find most interesting are the results that we got from those trials. Some discussion points and some take-home messages, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so the Metabrick Consortium. So in research, typically, we'll dip in and out of working with different groups. So, for example, myself at King's College, we'll work with people at local university, we'll do a trial, and we'll publish the data. But after a while, once you've developed a bit of a network, you develop what's called a consortium, where you become 4 or 5 individual groups connected together. All with a certain theme, all with a specialised interest. And in this case, we all had an interest in A, tackling disease with non-pharmacological interventions, but also looking for the different response types that we get from things that we think are quite simple paradigms, like exercise and nutrition, i.e. trying to break down this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all model and taking it a little bit further to try and add some specificity. And also, our main interest is the fact that we work in biomarkers, we work in things like genetics, we work in physiology. So we wanted to see if we could predict the responses that we find before individuals actually go down the avenue to engage in a training protocol. So this particular study that I'm going to talk to you about today was done or funded and overseen by the Metabrick entire consortium, of which I led this particular study. And we got £6 million from the EU to basically go out and go and see what exercise does to people who might be at risk of disease. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we did that later on. Okay, so this is just an overview of the paper that will be published. So as you all know, after a period of research, we have to have that research peer reviewed. So there's obviously going to be people who agree with your findings, there's also going to be people who disagree with your findings. And this process is to make sure, A, we're saying the right things, we're delivering the right messages, but also that we're not going to send the wrong messages out, the wrong tone out, and make sure that the work we've done is stand up, basically. And to put this into simple terms, Metabrick HIT trial, defining the heterogeneous response to high-intensity interval training, all that means is, let's give high-intensity training to people in a particular group and look at the varying responses that come out at the other end of it. Okay, so a little bit of a background on HIT. So we all know that the popularity of HIT has exploded in recent years, certainly. A lot of people get hooked up on Tabata training, that's always a very common one. Haruki Tabata is a great academic, but his research is, in my opinion, shit. So I wouldn't follow it. But HIIT actually isn't a new paradigm at all. So is there anyone with an exercise science background? Yeah. Okay, so these names here, you will be familiar with. So we've actually known about high intensity training since the early 60s. You know, this is something that we were already looking at as being a novel time-saving intervention, but to increase performance. But even then, if we look at this line here, even in the 1960s, we're already coming out with really good conclusions, really good statements, which is this type of training is not only, this is of interest not only for the training of sportsmen, but also for the rehabilitation of patients. So right at the very start, 1960s, we were already seeing the potential benefits of this training type. But unfortunately, as we know, this most important bit to me anyway, the patients element sort of dropped off the radar a little bit, and then it got really pushed through as a performance tool. So what do we associate HIIT training with? As I said, it's the performance side of things, and particularly in cycling actually in recent years. And what we know now we've been able to develop our testing procedures, and we can do more in-depth measures like gas analysis and VO2 and other gas measures. We've seen that by doing small amounts of HIIT, we can get a really big, robust change in aerobic capacity in a very short period of time. So that in itself is very interesting. But also, we see that there's other benefits for the athlete or trained individual. And that's that HIIT training is also good for muscular efficiency and muscular remodelling. And I mean, Chris will go into a long debate about that. And but there is some evidence to suggest that HIIT training can do that, especially now we can do more in-depth biochemistry on the muscle. We can see in certain cases that that's the case. And also what we're starting to see is that it's a time-saving modality. Not always, but we can see a lot of people who are using a tapering program, for example, might taper off towards the, just before an event, right down, and then they might have a big shunt of something like HIIT, not necessarily HIIT, but then just to put themselves back up. And again, that's more Chris's domain than mine. So keep that in mind. So that's the performance side of things, and that's what we know about elite sport and athletes and pre-athletes. But in parallel, what do we know about those sorts of measures? So aerobic capacity, we've got a bloke called Stephen Blair here, I'm sure some of you have come across before. And Stephen Blair showed us with his epidemiology over a span of years and years and years that VO2 max is actually probably the strongest predictor we have of all-cause mortality, stronger than any clinical test that we can do, any genetic test, any other blood test. The simple marker, or simple to us, is actually the strongest marker. So for example, if you've got the lowest boundary of VO2 max, you are the individuals, on average, that are the ones who are going to die or prematurely or have early onset cardiovascular disease. Equally, the flip side of that, if you're in the higher boundaries of that, you're the ones who are going to have the best survival rates. So it's a really, really robust measure, even though we see it as being something quite simple. So in a clinical population, we can already start to see that maybe we should be looking at not just improving health as we know health, but bringing in other concepts like bringing in things like VO2 max and trying to work on that. Things that you guys will be instrumental in doing. You're the experts in that. We just are able to measure it. We can't do anything with it. What else do we know? So for a lot of diseases, muscular inefficiency and things like atrophy are actually key drivers of that disease process. So I'll take something like type 2 diabetes, for example. One of the driving factors for people with type 2 diabetes and worsening type 2 diabetes is the fact that they will experience, in one way or another, some atrophy. And if they do, they have the worst prognosis out of anybody. Equally, the efficiency of their muscle drops massively. So again, you can already start to see these things that have impacted profoundly on a trained population can also be applied to a less standard population.
I'm just going to pause now for a minute.
Thanks everyone.
Okay. So, evidence-wise, so we know we've got long trials, research trials that we've shown can have an impact on disease prevalence, but invariably those have been lifestyle interventions. They have been exercise plus nutrition plus extra advice, whatever it may be. But we actually know in this particular population very little about the effect that exercise on its own as that independent factor has on the individual's overall health. So that brings us to sort of where our thinking came about from. It was, well, we know that we can have these really beneficial effects in the trained population using this particular exercise modality. We know these effects are closely related to clinical outcomes as well. So surely we should start to marry the two together in some way. There must be some way that we can improve the health of individuals by using the same methodologies. And is there a way that we can do that that actually brings into question national guidelines? You know, are they always the most effective guidelines to follow? And that was really our approach. Really, let's start to look for new and novel ways using this solid evidence base that we might be able to impact on cardiovascular disease. And then we also believe from our work that not only will everyone respond differently, but equally there will be biomarkers or some markers that we can use to be able to predict how that person will respond to a certain type of exercise before they actually do it. And some of you will know that some of my work has gone some way to do that with regards to VO2 max. Okay, so what I wanted to do here, now we get into the nuts and bolts of it, is look at HIT. HIT is quite an umbrella term. We just think of HIT and we think, right, that's the thing that's going to make us throw up after we've got off the bike. But actually, HIT, from an academic standpoint, is very, very broad. And I won't go into detail about these, but you know, roughly we can split HIT training up into 4 different subpopulations. So we have aerobic interval training, and that's usually characterised by long periods of exercise bouts with short periods of recovery. So the usual is the 4-4 protocol, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 10 reps of that at sort of a reduced intensity. So even though that's really hard, it's not full off the bike hard, much like a Wingate test would be. People who've come across Wingate test before, that's where sprint interval training sits. So that's super maximal training on the bike, 30 seconds, as hard as you could possibly ever go. Anyone who's ever done it will know it's horrible. It's the worst thing you'll ever do. If you're not sick, I'll be very surprised. Problem is, even though we've got some really good results from giving that to people, they can't actually leave the clinic or the gym because they can't walk, or you have to order in back of an ambulance. So we start to think, all right, well, we'll drop that one. And then the latest invention of HIT is REHIT. That's reduced exertion high intensity training. And that's actually just 2 20-second bouts. Similar to the sit training, but obviously taking 10 seconds off, and then only having the 2 repetitions of it, with a long break period in between. That's very, very new, but we're starting to see that that actually might be a good thing for the clinical populations, because it's short enough to be in and out of the door, short burst of pain, if you will, but some really good, robust clinical outcomes. But this is what we are interested in, this is what we describe as HIT, which is at about 80 to 100% of your max. Intervals are between 1 and 3 minutes, with usually with a matched recovery period. And we know that even though that's hard, very hard still, it's not as hard that you're going to fall off the bike, and it's not so short that you're not going to get any benefits from it. It just sat nicely in the middle. And it's also one that you can tailor quite well to the individual. Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of an idea of someone who comes into my trials, on this particular trial, what they're expected to do, and the information that we can glean from them. So, I'll give you a bit of an idea about the people who we recruited first of all, and the background behind it. So, we've got just under 190 subjects who did this, and we ran this in each of our centres. So, University of Nottingham, Karolinska, Copenhagen, Las Palmas, Loughborough, McMaster, which was fantastic for me because I got to spend loads of time in all these different places, you never hear. And what was quite nice, and something that is quite rare in these trials, is that we've got a nice match of males and females. And something that a question we had earlier was, you know, how heavy is it? Is it weighted towards the male population usually? And you know, to be fair, it is. So it's quite nice that we've actually got more females interested in doing this trial than we did the males. But nonetheless, the match-up was nice, so that was good. We've also got a nice age range here, because what we wanted to do, the overarching goal of our research trial was we wanted it to be as applicable as possible. We, as academics and researchers, we can get very granular sometimes, and too granular, to the point at which we've got ourselves a little population that isn't actually reflective of the real world. So we've got an age range here that clinically reflects that. You know, once you go above 53, you start looking at different systems and mechanisms. So we capped it at 53. Usually we would cap it at 50, but 53 was a nice endpoint. And if you look at our BMI ranges, and I know we all hate BMI, but we needed something to use as a marker. We can see there's such a huge, broad range here. We actually validated BMI against body fat percentage. So these weren't just elite rugby players and people with loads of muscle mass. These were bona fide clinically obese individuals. What was also very important for us was that all these people were sedentary. So we based that on less than 600 met minutes per week, as per guidance. There'll be some debate over whether that's the right number or not. But again, could be, if we look at this, even at this stage, could be reflective of the type of people who walk through your doors, potentially. People like my dad is what I would say that was like, so far. And then here's an interesting one. So we wanted people who were clinically healthy. You know, they weren't at risk of cardiovascular disease, cerebrospinal disease, etc., etc. But we wanted people who might be at risk of that. So we know from the BMIs already, and their ages to a certain degree, that we can already put them into that sort of profiling. But what we wanted to do is get people who didn't have diabetes, but if they didn't improve their lifestyle, could easily move on to being type 2 diabetic. So those people were accepted, but above and beyond that, we didn't want any symptoms for any other disease, which we got. And then to make it even more stringent, when people didn't attend 2 consecutive training sessions with us, we had to get rid of them. If they missed 3 or more sessions in total, across the entire time they were with us, we got rid of them, we didn't use that data. And if they failed to complete the actual exercise on 2 occasions, then again, we got rid of them. Because we only wanted to, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about signal and noise, if we just included those people who said, oh, we've missed 3, but we'll lump you in, that could actually have really big, significant effects on our data. We could come up with an average value that might not be at all reflective of anything. So we have to be really stringent that everyone that went through our protocols were getting the exact intervention that we expected them to get. So this is the training program that we gave them. So this was the HIT training protocol that we designed. And with HIT, as you all know, there's 100 ways to skin a cat, right? You know, we could have picked anything, but what we did is we looked through all of the literature, we looked at what was effective in this population, and then made our best estimates as to how much could we decrease this, but still have an effect at the end of it. So we did 3 sessions a week for 6 weeks. Everyone did that, other than our control group who didn't do any exercise. So that's only 18 sessions from start to finish, that's all they did.